Well, welcome back to another episode of Finding Your Way in Family, Kinship, Adoptive, Foster Care Parenting in West Virginia. I'm Sky Kershaw. I'm here with Dina Shelton. And Dina, we've talked a lot about in the other episodes about things like boundaries and expectations. And I was noticing how expectations feel really important to you in terms of ways that parents can kind of paint themselves into a corner or get kind of disappointed or angry or frustrated. Let's talk a little bit about just kind of what considerations one might have if you're thinking about doing this. I know sometimes the baby just falls into your lap because it's your niece and nobody else is there to take it. And other times, um, I mean, people come to this through a lot of different pathways.
hmm Absolutely. I'm very passionate on talking about expectations because as humans, we just naturally have expectations on the way that things are going. And so often those are not things that are conscious thoughts. They're things that are driving us that we don't may not even realize we're getting frustrated or disappointed or
Mm,
down because our expectations are being challenged, not just because of what's
mm,
going on around us. And that does tie into even the choice and the decision making in deciding whether you want to be a foster, adopt, or kinship placement for a child who's not born to you. And each of those situations are different as well in terms of, like you said, sometimes it's a family member and it kind of falls into your lap, but we still have a process after that of deciding, is this going to be a long term thing or not? Am I going to commit to this or not? Is this something that I'm willing to do in a temporary capacity, and making conscious decisions about that, even if it feels like it's sprung on us? And then also knowing legitimately and realistically what we're saying yes to, and embracing that fully, and realizing that take it from someone. We adopted our children 9 years ago, and no matter how much you know and how much you're trained, there are days that it just feels like a mess, and you question if you are capable, if you were the right person to do this, if you made the wrong decision, if you're messing everything up more than helping. All of those things are regular and common experiences, and even just knowing and recognizing that ahead of time, that this is not a standard or stable experience throughout the course of your life, no more than parenting in any other way is, right?
mm. A lot
hmm
of moving parts and a lot of ups and downs with it. Um, I'm thinking it takes it's not just someone with a big heart who sees the need. The need is huge here in West Virginia, right? We
Yes,
have so many kids who are needing placements or in the system, and at the same time, it is a big decision,
hmm
and it can take a toll on a marriage. It can take a toll on a family. I've known
absolutely.
several folks who their marriage was really challenged by trying to provide a secure container for a kid who was kind of bouncing off the walls, and really put a lot of stress and strain on the married or the couple's relationship.
Absolutely. And it's like any other relationship that you choose. You can liken it, and I do liken adopting oftentimes to getting married, because it is a choice based relationship, and love grows and builds and deepens. It's not the exact same pathway as birthing a child. But when you choose a committed relationship like a marriage, we always, when I was doing marriage counseling primarily, I always talked about how marriage, it's just a really big mirror. It shows you the best and worst parts of yourself.
Mm,
You realize that can be more selfless and more altruistic and more loving than you recognize you were capable of, and also more selfish and more self-centered and demanding, and things that we don't really like to address and adjust. So it just heightens a lot of those processes. I
mm,
love what you said about this. You're right. So many people come into thinking about adopting or fostering from the right heart. you have a heart for this, you see a need, you care deeply. Oftentimes it ties to values or faith, things that are really big guidance points in our lives. And if you are feeling that, I would tell you, and I really would say everyone has a role to play in the story of children who do not have families, in children who are vulnerable and who have experienced difficult things early in life. Everyone has a role. Um, it's really important to not only see adoption and foster care as the only role. I
Hmm.
hope to continue to see, especially churches and communities, come together to support families who are adopting. Not everyone is in a place, like you said, where their marriage or their family is stable enough. If you've had a job loss or you've lost a child, that's not necessarily the right time or place to bring someone in, but that doesn't mean that you can't fully support other families very practically to do so. So I always tell people, if you have a heart for this, you find where you fit.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
doing respite, getting trained to provide childcare for children who are in care for the parents who are housing them long term, who are adopting or who are fostering. It's hard to find people who can and will provide childcare outside because it can be more complicated and more difficult. You have to go through background checks. It's a huge place of service that there's so much need for.
Hmm.
Go find an adoption agency, get a background check, provide respite care, and support
Hmm.
parents who are doing it if you're not in a place to do that. There are so many other ways to support. It's not you can adopt or foster or not. There's so many other options and opportunities to be a part of the story.
I love that idea, Dina, especially because if you were to do that, if I were to do that, I would get to know what it's like from the inside, and I'd be getting to know the parents who I was giving respite to. Uh,
Hmm.
so how would that work? Is that like you make yourself available as a babysitter?
Yeah,
Except
yeah,
you have
it's
to go through these hoops to do that.
It's called Respite Care in Texas. It may be called something else in West Virginia, but the state provides it, and most private adoption agencies also provide it. So you could reach out to one if you were, thinking about how to get involved. If you find a foster adoption agency, or you can get a hold of the state office that provides it, you can ask, "How do I provide childcare on a temporary basis?" There are situations where families need to go out of town or make trips, and there needs to be places for children who can't leave the state because it's not allowed, those
Hmm.
kinds of things.
Oh,
And
okay.
having safe and secure people, especially consistent people in these children's lives, the more consistent adults that they have, including for childcare, the better their outcomes are.
Hmm.
And so it would just be reaching out and asking, hey, what are the steps and how would I go through the process to provide childcare and respite care for foster and adoptive parents?
And if
And they
you
give you the steps.
and if you hit it off or you connect well with a family or with a child or several kids, you might be that's your family that you're helping. Every summer they go to Maine and or Alabama, and so you're going to help with that kid
Mhm.
while they're away for that week or something like that.
Yeah, it can be on a consistent basis, or you can just be available until, our
Mm.
private adoption agencies here love it when people say, hey, my even older teenagers can go through that process and
Mm.
provide care as well, and say, you can put us on a list and give us to people who say, I'm having a hard time finding childcare.
Wow.
So it can be on a very consistent basis with some families. It can be on an as needed basis with others. And just like any other person, you have freedom in that. It can be, well, we don't do overnight, but we'll do days. We aren't going to do days in a few hours, but we'll do a week at a time or something like that. If it's long term, you have options, at least here. And I can't imagine it wouldn't be that way everywhere else. It's just that you've been approved by the state
Yeah.
to be a child care provider for a child who the state has, managing conservatorship over.
Wow. And what kind of special situations might you find if you were to do that? How would this be different from being a babysitter to or providing care for any other kid?
Yeah, I would. I mean, think that knowledge and background on what a child in a traumatic system, and in a traumatic situation who's experienced trauma goes through, or how they react or respond, is going to be pretty different from a child who's never experienced any trauma. And we say trauma, a lot of times people think of very significant abuse or neglect. And that notwithstanding, which is some of these kids' backgrounds, just being removed from their primary caregivers is a traumatic experience.
Mm.
They're in the middle of one right now.
Mm.
And so recognizing that there's going to be more emotions and more emotions that don't make sense, especially if the children are newly removed or if they had a long history of difficulties. But it takes really committed people to be willing to contain and hold that in a different way, and to be willing to learn about it, and to hear from a parent how to address a problem that may not be how you would normally address. Children who have had this type of background don't respond to the same types of discipline. They don't respond to the same types of consequence systems, like positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement or punishment. That process is not quite as logical for them
Mm.
because of some ways that they've had to navigate. And so you learn along the way too, and it's a high connection environment. It's highly connected caregiving because it has to be in tune, and it doesn't follow a set model all of the time.
Mm.
It's tuning in and knowing what to do in the moment to help meet needs and hold boundaries with kids. And it's just a different mode of working. And so agencies, there's a background check and some other things, and usually they provide some resources as well. But that may be something too that you could get from, especially if you know families and you're doing it for them, families at your church, families in your community, families in your neighborhood, to say,
Mm.
I'd be happy to help in this way. If it's helpful, what would I do? What would I do to be able to help? They usually can tell you too. And they even provide you with the resources. Typically the parents, foster and adopt, can provide anybody with resources and suggestions on what to learn to help their specific kids too. And that's what's so fantastic about it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. As we've been doing these podcasts and I've been talking with people, I've been really surprised at how many folks are doing foster adoptive kinship care, or have come themselves through the system and are now adults. And so the chances are probably pretty good that you may already know somebody who you could help, and because you already know them, that might increase the comfort level in terms of what you might be willing to do if you wanted to kind of wade into this from the shallow end.
Mm-hmm. You absolutely can. And you're not under any obligation. It's kind of like a babysitting certification, like when
Mm.
younger girls go and get CPR certified and say, I have all this training to babysit, and then people can hire them or not. It's the same thing. It's just that you have to be background checked to even be eligible to provide care
Right, the
for a child. It was one of
families.
the best gifts that I was given. There were a couple of families in our church when they found out that we were in the process, that we'd been matched and we were going to get placed. They said, we'll help you with childcare. And I said, it's a very complicated process. So you have to get background checks. And they said, well, tell us what to do. And so several of them went through the whole process before we got placed. And so if we showed up at church on a Sunday, and I was a brand new parent with older children, they were 4 and 6. And I looked as haggard as I know that I was at times. And one of them would say, I'm taking your kids home with me this afternoon. And I could say
Mm.
yes, because they were
Mm.
already approved through the state. And it was
Mm.
just such a gift to be able to go home and sleep, or go home and rest and get some things done, and know that they were being taken care of by people that loved us and loved them. And so if you know families like that, it's such a gift to them. And also, if you don't, and you say, I want to know families like this, your agencies can connect you with people who need this level of support,
Mm.
absolutely need it, or desperate for it sometimes. And it
Mm.
is hard to find right now.
Mm. What a beautiful gift. And I love this phrase that you said, finding where you fit, because a lot of people recognize the crisis that we're in with our young people and want to do something to help. And
Mm-hmm.
and I love how you're bringing in all these different layers or levels where folks can plug in and then plug out, and not not have to go all the way in and then as has happened with some of my friends, discover it was a mistake for them,
Yeah.
and they wind up having to unwind and untangle from it.
hmm
What's your
There are
experience on that side of things, Dina?
quite a bit in knowing, call it disruption, when a placement um, when a placement ends, whether it's an adoptive or a foster placement, and when we study it and we look at it, we call it a disruption, because the point of placing a child somewhere is never for them to have to leave in a negative way, right? If
Mm,
it's a foster placement, hopefully the move would be to a permanent home,
mm,
whether back with their biological parents, which is always preferred if you can do that, or with an adoptive home that's a permanent placement. But when a child feels when adults in a home feel like a child is not they can't help the child, they aren't being successful with the child, and that child has to move to another foster home, or if it's an adoptive placement and the parents decide this is not something that we can do with this child or in general, and that disruption happens, it's one of the most difficult things that can happen for a child,
mm,
because anytime a disruption happens, it it's a traumatic experience for everyone, the child, for the family. People really can demonize sometimes parents for making hard decisions, and that is
mm,
not the right way to look at things. So I want to say first, the grace on these situations, that these situations are hard and they are difficult, and it is not a situation where I would say, well, every single situation is just able to be saved. You just have to know the right things to do and the best things to do. That's not really true.
mm,
These are very broken situations at time, and it requires a lot of grace and connection as humans. But I found that there are a lot of pieces um, of, of prep work that people can do that are that haven't really been explored or unearthed. That's what I studied in my dissertation work. I'm in the process of putting it together in a book for
mm,
preparation for this very thing, because there are really relevant and practical ways that we can look at our mindsets and our perspective on things that we know help and are beneficial to good outcomes in these situations. And there's some skill work that can be built and done before placement.
mm,
And so, and some of this is new research. It's stuff that we're learning because we're asking the right questions too. And so, um, but just a few, and we'll go through all of them, but things like recognizing as a parent, so often we go into situations where we feel like we're in over our heads,
mm,
and that's our default, is I'm in over my head, I don't know what to do, and I'm making this worse than it is. And
mm,
we work from that place in any capacity. If we haven't challenged that mindset and shifted it to recognizing our role of authority and of guidance in our family system as the parents and adults, that when we feel like we're drowning, that doesn't mean that everything's sinking and we're just in a mess. It's an opportunity that we can turn around and take mentally, put ourselves back in that position of being able to navigate this. And until we have that perspective work and prospect work done, we really can struggle a lot more. But doing that on the front end helps
mm.
before the placement, so that it can be done inside of the situations when it's hard to. Things like
Yeah.
that.
I really appreciate what you're saying, that it's re-traumatizing, or it can be, for the child. And I think it's traumatizing for the parents too. A lot of parents that I've talked to who have decided it wasn't for them, they probably held on longer than they needed to. And I'm thinking of that instruction that Jesus gave his disciples. If you come to a town and they're not interested in your message, move on. Don't
Mhm.
dig in and set up a cinder block wall, and try to make something work that isn't going to work. And so I love
Mhm.
this idea of grace, that it 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 takes grace to let go and say this isn't working, or to ask for help, uh, or to try to figure out what's going to be best, not just for the child but also for you and your family. Um,
Yeah. And for parents who've been in that situation, A lot of times they, make bigger decisions about whether or not they ever, if they have a failed placement, they may feel like they need to make decisions about whether or not they'll ever do something again, or we get into very black and white thinking really quickly on whose fault was it. Either the kids or mine, and that's not a helpful place because it's not that clear ever. And you are right, and that's definitely what I intended to come across with it is traumatic for the child. It's traumatic for everyone involved. It's traumatic for siblings. It's traumatic for foster and adoptive. So it is a difficult experience for the parent. It is hard for everybody. And so if and when that happens, there may be places of responsibility that people need to take as part of their healthy growth. Everyone in that situation also needs help and support and
Yeah.
grace.
Yeah. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're really wondering if you made a mistake, we encourage you to reach out. Sometimes it's this period will pass, and you'll come out the other side, and other times it's I mean, that's such a hard, in my mind, that's one of the hardest questions in life, when to hold on and when to let go. And, because you've described so honestly, Dina, really being at the bottom of a valley, and really having hard times as a foster kinship adoptive parent. And I'm sure felt like giving up, and maybe even thought about it and talked about it. And it's so hard to know, should we hang in there to this longer, or are we doing any good here?
Yeah. And one of the things that I would say first on that is don't wait to ask those types of questions, because so often those questions have to be asked, because earlier when it was, I'm not feeling confident about this and I need help, or maybe we hesitate to say I need help because we think if we need help at this point, then maybe we weren't cut out for this altogether. And the truth is there's not a single one of us cut out for it any other way. You cannot island this. You cannot, none of us have the stamina, the mindset, the mental fortitude, or just none of us have enough in us to do this alone. And that's one of those feedback cycles in this process that can get really damaging, that we feel like we should be strong enough to do it because we've decided to, and we don't want to throw our stress on anybody else, but we can't do it another way without the connection. And it is so helpful. Oh my goodness, it is so helpful as a foster adopt kinship parent to go, this is what's going on and I am drowning. And people go, been there. Oh, I've been there. Yep, absolutely. And just to say, yep, question it too. Thought about, quitting, wondered, every other day for a while if I was doing the right thing, wondered every day if I was making things worse. And here is some more perspective on our story. We're 9 years in. I have every story, some version of every story with my kids.
Yeah. That last part reminds me, actually, I think I want to stop here and we'll do a part 2, because I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the toll it can take on parents, especially, parenting is always hard. And when parents have different styles and they have trouble negotiating, or they start criticizing the other one for either being too tough or too lenient, which is the usual way it goes. So let's take a break here and we'll come back and do part 2. Sky Kirshner for the Finding Your Way Through Kinship Foster Adoptive Care, here with Dina Shelton, signing off, and join us again for part 2.